Hey, it's Linda, and this is Coffee and Crime. This podcast explores real cases involving violence, loss, and the darker side of human nature. Some details may be confronting. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Aberdeen, a small country town in the Upper Hunter of New South Wales. A place surrounded by farmland and open country. A place where everyone knows everyone, if not by name, by face. And in 2000, two of those familiar faces were John Price and Katherine Knight. John Charles Thomas Price was 44 years old. He was a father. He worked hard. And he was known around the Aberdeen community as a terrific bloke. Katherine Mary Knight was 44 as well. She was also an experienced abattoir worker. The two had been in a relationship, but by the beginning of 2000, that relationship had deteriorated badly. John wanted it to end. And by the final day of his life, he was frightened enough to seek protection from Katherine. Less than 24 hours later, John Price was dead. Inside his home in Aberdeen was a crime scene that would shock the country. To understand why this case shook Australia, you have to understand Aberdeen. This was not a suburb of a major city where neighbours barely spoke. Aberdeen was a working town. People rose early. They worked in the mines, in agriculture, and in the abattoirs. And when the shift ended, they often saw the same people again at the shops, the pub, the football ground, or the RSL. John Price and Katherine Knight were not strangers whose lives briefly crossed. They had worked in the same town. People knew them. People had opinions about them. And when violence happens in a small town, the shock travels differently. It doesn't remain quiet in one house. It moves through workplaces, through families, through schools, through every conversation that begins with the words, "Have you heard?" By the morning of the 1st of March 2000, Aberdeen would become a place known across the country for something almost impossible to understand. Katherine Knight grew up in Tenterfield, roughly 500 kilometres from Aberdeen. She was raised in a family home that was anything but stable. There was violence, alcoholism, broken relationships, and allegations of sexual abuse. Accounts of her childhood describe Katherine as aggressive and difficult at school. In 1969, her family moved to Aberdeen. After leaving school at just 15 years old, Katherine found work at the abattoir. She said it was her dream job, surrounded by carcasses, meat hooks and knives. The abattoir was not just a workplace, it was a world. A world of early starts, heavy labour, noise, blood and sharp tools. Workers learned to move quickly and confidently around knives. They learned how to cut with precision. They learned how to prepare skin, fat, muscle and bone. For most workers, those skills were simply part of earning a living. But for Katherine, the work became something more. She was good at it. She understood the tools. She understood the work. The abattoir gave Katherine skills that would later become significant. She knew how to handle knives. She knew how to work with meat. And she had years of experience doing it. By the time she was a young woman, people around Aberdeen had already formed an opinion of her. Katherine could be frightening when she was angry. And as she grew older, that temper would follow her into relationships. Katherine often became obsessed with the men in her life. But those relationships would turn volatile very quickly. There was jealousy, arguments, rejection, and increasingly violence. When Katherine was 18, she met David Knight while they were both working at the abattoir. The following year, they married, but the marriage was troubled almost from the beginning. Knight had his own problems, including heavy drinking, and Katherine was violent towards him. During one incident, David arrived home late from a dance competition while Katherine was pregnant. An argument followed, and Katherine attacked him with a frying pan. David fled the house and collapsed at a neighbour's home. He had suffered a severe fracture to his skull. Eventually, he left. The marriage broke down. David Knight left Katherine and went to Queensland with another woman. But Katherine's own circumstances were about to deteriorate further. Around this period, shortly after the birth of her daughter Melissa, Katherine was seen walking through the main street with the baby in a pram. She was pushing the pram violently from side to side. People noticed. Katherine was taken to St Elmo's Hospital in Tamworth, where she was diagnosed with postnatal depression and remained there for several weeks. But leaving hospital did not bring the crisis to an end. It was only the beginning of something far more disturbing. After her release from St Elmo's Hospital, Katherine took her 2-month-old daughter Melissa to a railway line. A train was due to pass, and the infant was placed on the tracks. Nearby, a man known as Old Ted was foraging around the railway line, and he found the baby. He pulled her to safety before the train arrived. Katherine then obtained an axe and went into town, where she threatened to kill several people. Again, the police were called. Katherine was arrested and taken back to St Elmo's Hospital. But the following day, Katherine left the hospital. But Katherine was not finished yet. A few days after leaving St Elmo's, she confronted a woman and attacked her, cutting her face. Katherine demanded that the woman drive her to Queensland. She wanted to find David Knight. The woman had little choice but to comply, and for a time she drove, until they reached a service station. This was her opportunity to escape, and she took it. The woman managed to get away from Katherine and sought help. But when police arrived, the situation had already changed. Katherine had taken a young boy hostage. She was threatening him with a knife. Police moved in and they managed to disarm Katherine and take her into custody. This time, she wasn't simply returned to St Elmo's. Katherine was admitted to Morisset Psychiatric Hospital. And there, she told the nurses what she had intended to do. She wanted to kill the mechanic at the service station because he had repaired David's car, the car that allowed him to leave her. And her plans didn't end there. She intended to find David in Queensland, and she intended to kill him and his mother. What began as a young mother's mental health crisis had now become a series of dangerous incidents. David was eventually told what had happened, and despite everything that had occurred between them, he returned. He went back to support Katherine. Upon Katherine's release, the couple eventually moved to Queensland and had another daughter. But the marriage didn't last. By the 1980s, their relationship was over. In 1986, she became involved with a minor, David Saunders. David moved in with Katherine and her two daughters, but he maintained his apartment in Scone. The relationship would quickly become unpredictable. Knight could become jealous of what Saunders did when she wasn't around, and arguments could result in him being thrown out of the house. He would leave, and then Katherine would follow him. She would follow him and she would plead with him to come back. The relationship became a cycle. Together, apart. Together again. But violence was never far away. In May 1987, Katherine killed Saunders' 2-month-old dingo pup in front of him. Knight claimed Saunders had kicked her in the stomach when she thought she was pregnant, and that she then killed the puppy as an act of revenge. She then knocked Saunders unconscious with a frying pan. The following year, in June 1988, Katherine gave birth to another daughter, Sarah. For a time, Saunders tried to build something more permanent with Katherine. He put a deposit on a house, but a house could not make a relationship stable. The violence continued, and eventually, after another confrontation, Saunders left. He returned to Scone and later took long service leave, going into hiding. He was trying to put as much distance as he could between himself and Katherine. There were other relationships after Saunders. Katherine later had another child with a former abattoir co-worker, John Chillingworth. That relationship lasted a few years, but it would also come to an end. But while she was still with Chillingworth, Katherine had begun a relationship with another man. His name was John Price. And that relationship would become the final chapter in Katherine Knight's history of relationships. A relationship that would begin with an affair and end in murder. John was different. He was social. He joked with workmates. He enjoyed spending time with friends. He had children that he cared about deeply. He had a life before Katherine Knight, with routines, responsibilities, friendships, and plans. And it's that ordinary life that makes the ending so difficult. John worked in the mines. He earned a good living and he had his own home in Aberdeen. It was a place that he intended to keep for his children. By the time Katherine entered his life, John was already aware of her reputation, but he still allowed her into his home. At first, things seemed to work. They had a life together. There were children around the house. And for a time, despite the arguments, life appeared almost normal. But behind closed doors, the relationship was becoming more and more difficult. The arguments became more frequent, and eventually, John wanted out. In 1998, the relationship reached a breaking point when John refused to marry Katherine. After their argument over marriage, she video recorded him taking expired medical supplies from his workplace's rubbish area and then sent that footage to his employer. After 17 years in his job, John was fired. That same day, he told Katherine to leave his house. But, as had happened before, they eventually reconciled. But when they got back together, the old problems hadn't disappeared. They were still there. Katherine wanted to come back into John's home, but John refused. He wanted the house for himself and his children. John had drawn a line. Katherine could still see him, but she wasn't moving back into his home. And the arguments didn't stop. They became more frequent. And with every argument, the distance between them grew. Friends noticed the tension. And then, in February 2000, everything changed. In the days before John's death, things had become worse. There had been violence between them. There had been arguments. And John had reached the point where he wanted Katherine gone. During the relationship, Katherine had attacked John with a knife, slicing his left chest. The scar was still visible. John entered the relationship again, and this time he went to court. He applied for an apprehended violence order to keep Katherine away from him and his children. For John, it was an attempt to finally put distance between them. He had no idea how little time he had left. John was trying to create distance while still protecting his children. That's one of the details that often gets lost. He wasn't simply trying to walk away. He was trying to manage a situation that he believed could become dangerous. He had reached the point where he believed that he needed the law between himself and Katherine Knight. After leaving court, John went back to work. That afternoon, he spoke with his workmates, and what he said would later become one of the most chilling pieces of evidence in the case. John told them that if he didn't turn up for work the following morning, that they should assume that Katherine had killed him. They were worried for John's safety. They pleaded with him not to go home, but John had to go home. He still expected to wake up the next morning and go to work, but he never would. After John had come home, he had realised that Katherine had sent the children away for a sleepover. So he went to the neighbour's house. They talked, and eventually he came home around 11 p.m. and went to bed. Nothing about the evening suggested that it would become one of the most notorious nights in Australian criminal history. And that makes what happened next all the more haunting. There is a tendency when we know the ending to imagine that the danger announces itself. Usually it doesn't. Usually it arrives inside an ordinary evening. And that is exactly what happened here. It was late on the night of the 29th of February 2000. Aberdeen is quiet. The house was quiet. But as John slept, Katherine let herself in with her spare key. She sat watching television for a few minutes before having a shower. Knight woke Price and the pair were intimate. We don't know what was going through his mind. Perhaps he believed that the danger had passed. Perhaps he simply didn't want another confrontation. The evidence doesn't give us that answer. What we do know is that John fell asleep believing the night was over. But it wasn't. John is lying down, and then Katherine attacks him with a butcher's knife. The first wounds are inflicted while John is still in the bedroom. He's stabbed repeatedly. Some of the wounds were deep enough to reach vital organs. John is badly injured, but he's still alive. He gets off the bed and moves towards the bedroom door. Katherine follows him. John makes it into the hallway. He is badly wounded, but he keeps moving. He's trying to get away. But Katherine catches up with him. The attack continues. John is stabbed again and again, including wounds to his back. And still, he keeps moving. John is stabbed at least 37 times. He is covered in blood. There is blood on the floor, blood on the walls. A trail of blood marks his desperate path from the bedroom. John reaches toward the light switch, and the attack continues. More wounds are inflicted to the front of his body. John is desperately trying to get to the door. The front door is only a short distance away. He reaches it. His hand finds the handle. John reaches the front door. He opens it. Blood is found on the outside door handle. John has made it outside. But somehow he ended up back inside. Whether he was dragged back into the house or returned himself, the evidence couldn't establish with certainty. What is clear is where he ended up: the hallway. John lies on the hallway floor. He is no longer trying to escape. The blood continues to spread across the floor around him. Somewhere in those final moments, John Price died. The attack was over, but the night wasn't. Some time passes. John's body remains in the hallway, and then Katherine moves him. She drags John from the hallway and into the lounge room. As his body is moved, blood is left across the floor. Everything that happened next came after the murder. She removes John's skin. The work was carried out with skill. Katherine took it to the lounge room. There was a meat hook and she hung it there. John's head is still attached to his body for now. But sometime before 7:30 that morning, Katherine removes it. John's remains were then deliberately posed in the lounge room. But Katherine wasn't finished yet. Katherine takes slices of John's buttocks into the kitchen. She begins preparing food. A large pot is brought out and John's head is placed inside. The vegetables go in with it. The stove is turned on and Katherine begins cooking. Outside, Aberdeen is still sleeping. But inside this kitchen, something unimaginable is happening. The pot continues heating, and Katherine keeps working. The pieces taken from John's body are placed in the oven with vegetables, and eventually, plates are prepared. 2 meals. One for John's son, one for John's daughter. The plates are arranged, and beside them, there are notes written by Katherine. The messages are vindictive. They are intended for John's children. A third piece is taken outside and it's left on the back lawn. No one can say with certainty why. Perhaps it was intended for the dogs, or perhaps for another purpose. The night is almost over. Inside the house, the evidence of what happened is everywhere. The bedroom, the hallway, the lounge room, the kitchen, and the remains of John Price. But right now, the police haven't arrived. John's workmates don't know. His children don't know. And inside the house, Katherine is still there. But before the night is over, she makes one more move. She withdraws $1,000 from John Price's bank account. And she leaves something else behind. A handwritten, blood-stained note. It contained accusations against John, along with messages directed at his children. But the accusations would later be found to be groundless. That morning, a neighbour notices that John's car is still in the driveway. And when he didn't arrive at work, his employer sent a worker to see what was wrong. Both the neighbour and the worker tried knocking on John's bedroom window to wake him up. Silence. They move around to the front door and they see blood. They immediately contact the police. Inside the house, police find John. He was dead. And what the police found would shock even experienced officers. The scene showed evidence of violence, and it showed that what happened to John did not end when he died. And then there was Katherine. She had taken medication and she was found unconscious. She was taken to hospital for treatment. But for the officers arriving that morning, this was supposed to be an investigation into a death. But almost immediately, they were confronted with something far darker. The first task was to preserve the scene. Photographs were taken, measurements recorded, objects documented. Forensic specialists began examining the house, and the blood became one of the most important pieces of evidence. Its distribution through the bedroom, hallway, and front door helped investigators to reconstruct John's final movements. Where the attack began, where John had moved, and where he finally collapsed in the hallway. Outside, Aberdeen was beginning to wake. People were hearing that something had happened at Pricey's house. But inside, investigators were only beginning to understand what had happened there. Investigators had to reconstruct the night. Where had the attack begun? How had John Price moved through the house? Had he tried to escape? And what happened after he reached the hallway? The blood told them where he had been. The stains, the smears, the marks left across the house. Each one becomes another piece of the timeline. Investigators began working backwards, tracing John's movements. Through the rooms, through the hallway, toward the front door. By the time the case reached court, the Crown argued that John had been deliberately killed, followed by extensive acts carried out after his death. The evidence could help explain what had happened, but it couldn't answer the question at the heart of the case. Why? Why had Katherine killed John Price? The court considered the breakdown of the relationship, John's determination to end it, his desire to keep his home for his children, and Katherine's resentment surrounding the end of the relationship. Justice O'Keefe ultimately concluded that the killing was the playing out of those resentments. But motive could only explain so much. Katherine's lawyers presented psychiatric evidence. The court heard about her background. It heard about her history of violence and abuse. Psychiatrists assessed her mental state, and among the diagnoses considered by the court was borderline personality disorder. So the court had to look beyond the physical evidence of the murder and had to look at Katherine herself, her history, her mental health, the experiences that had shaped her, and ultimately how much those things had influenced her actions and her responsibility for what she had done. But the judge drew an important line. A difficult past can help explain a person's behaviour, but it does not on its own excuse a crime. Justice O'Keefe considered Katherine's psychiatric evidence, her history, the other material put before the court. But when he weighed everything together, he reached a clear conclusion. None of it reduced the seriousness of what had happened to John enough to justify anything less than the maximum penalty. On the 8th of November 2001, Katherine Knight was sentenced. She received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The court ordered that she was never to be released. It was the first time a woman in Australia had been sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Katherine Knight would spend the rest of her life in prison. The legal process was over, but the case itself was not forgotten. The questions it raised about violence, control, fear, and what can happen when a relationship breaks down remained. For a small community, a murder like this changes everything. Once those details became public, the case exploded across Australian media. The story was everywhere, front pages, evening news, radio. And as the details of what happened inside that Aberdeen house emerged, the story travelled far beyond Australia. But beneath the headlines, the details of John's death were becoming the story itself. And Katherine Knight was no longer simply a woman accused of murder. She had become a name the entire country knew. The offender becomes the headline, and the victim becomes the detail beneath it. But for Aberdeen, it was different. This wasn't a story happening far away. People knew these streets. They knew the workplaces. They knew the families. They knew John. And they knew Katherine. These weren't strangers in a newspaper story. They were people from their own community. For many people who remember 2000, there is also a memory that sits beneath the surface of the town. The memory of police cars, news crews, whispers, shock, and the knowledge that something unimaginable happened behind the walls of a familiar house. Tonight, if you drive through Aberdeen, you will still find a small country town in the Upper Hunter. People still work, children still go to school, cars still pull into driveways, and most houses contain nothing more dramatic than the ordinary business of family life. This story doesn't end with Katherine Knight. It comes back to John. Because John was more than a victim at the centre of a notorious case. He was a father. He worked hard. He had friends. He had a home. He had a life that existed long before that final night. On the 29th of February 2000, John went home believing that he would wake up the next morning and go about his life. He didn't. And somewhere beneath the headlines, the courtroom evidence, and everything that came after, there was a man whose life was taken. And if John's story has reminded you of something that is happening in your own life, I want to say one more thing before we go. If you are listening to this and something in John's story feels uncomfortably familiar, I want you to hear this. If you are experiencing domestic violence, what is happening to you is not your fault. You don't have to wait until things become worse before asking for help. You don't have to explain away the behaviour. And you don't have to face it alone. Talk to somebody that you trust. Reach out to a professional service. If you're in immediate danger, contact emergency services. You deserve to be safe. And you deserve to be believed. Until next time. Not every case finds closure. Not every question gets answered. And sometimes the truth stays buried long after the headlines fade. This has been Coffee and Crime AU. For deeper into the case, visit Coffee and Crime AU online. Until next time.